everything built up inside me. Before you know it, I put my arm around her, and that was it.
To lure his youngest strangling victim, Mary Sullivan, Albert explained that he used his green man ploy.
I told her I'd come up there to do some work in the apartment. And she said, well, I didn't know nothing about it. But anyhow, she invited me in. I went in with her, and that's where I put the knife to her. And told her, don't scream. I won't hurt you. She was still alive when I had intercourse with her. She allowed me to do it to her. You understand me? After I had taken her clothes off, right? I said, now I'm going to tie you up. I'm going to leave. And I straddled her. So that her hands, I was sitting on, really. Because she was really fighting viciously, trying to get up, for life. And I got on top of her so that she could not be in any position to, reach up and scratch me. Strangle it.
The next grim detail Albert described was one that only Sullivan's killer could have known.
There's something I did with her.
What did you do with her?
I know I left the broom inside her, but I didn't insert it to hurt her and penetrate her. You understand me?
In all, Albert claimed he killed 13 women, 2 more than the police suspected. But after hours of talking with him, all the authorities had was talk. They couldn't link any physical evidence to Albert. That was not for lack of trying. There were no witnesses. Fingerprints from the scenes did not match Albert. Nothing connected him to the crimes except his word.
He knew a lot of details that had not been in print. So we felt that if he were not the Boston Strangler, he either knew the Strangler or had been with the Strangler.
The people of Boston wanted to believe that the Strangler had been discovered at last, but there were skeptics. The Strangler story had been front-page news for nearly 2 solid years. Albert could surely have studied the crimes from the news coverage.
It is very interesting to me that Albert's confession reproduces the misinformation that appeared in the newspapers. For example, he grossly mistook the time of day that one of the murders was committed. He was mistaken about the type of weapon in another case.
The police had agreed not to use DeSalvo's confessions as evidence against him, and they'd been unable to corroborate Albert's admissions with physical evidence. That meant that Albert was never actually charged with the Boston Stranglings and never stood trial for them. Instead, he was tried only for rapes he committed as the Green Man. Of course, considering his confessions, most people, including journalists, considered the Strangler mystery solved.
To this day, everyone who read those papers believed that Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler.
Defending Albert on the Green Man charges, Bailey tried from the outset to convince the jury, all of whom had heard of Albert's confessions to the Boston Stranglings, that Albert was insane.
I hope that they recognize insanity, because I think it will promote some interest in finding out why he is the way he is.
The prosecution said Albert knew right from wrong.
He would tie the women up. He would touch them on their breast, in their private parts. He was able to carry on a conversation. He was not ranting or raving or incomprehensible as he spoke to the many victims. We use that as a sign that he was sane and that he knew he was committing criminal acts.
The trial lasted 8 days. The jury took 4 hours to reach its verdict, guilty, but not insane.
I felt that we had given them a common sense, logical case, and I am pleased that they saw it our way, sir.
Albert was convicted on all charges. The judge sentenced DeSalvo to life in prison. Albert DeSalvo had never been formally charged with killing any of the victims of the Boston Strangler. Technically, all the cases remained open. But as far as a relieved nation was concerned, the Boston Strangler was at last behind bars. But Albert had other plans. Convicted of a series of rapes, Albert DeSalvo had been sentenced to life in prison. He had confessed to being the Boston Strangler, but would never stand trial for those crimes. In January 1967, he was returned to the mental hospital, awaiting transport to prison. A month later, he connived with 2 other patients to break out.
Insofar as we know, one of them, at least, must have had either a key or some type of metal artifact, whereby he was able to put his arm out of what is known as the peephole in the door
The three escapees jumped down an elevator shaft under construction and scaled a brick wall. In Boston, they split up. Midnight, February 23rd, 1967. Albert DeSalvo was on the loose. Once again, fear gripped Boston.
It was a repetition of what they had gone through when he was running around loose, killing people. Believe me when I tell you, the population of Greater Boston is 2 million. Let's say 1 million were women. 1 million women were in panic in Greater Boston at that time.
One newspaper offered a $5,000 reward for Albert's capture. DeSalvo's lawyer, F. Lee Bailey, said he would double that amount if Albert was captured unharmed. Police, heavily armed and carrying tear gas guns, combed the state.
The hysteria was incredible. It was front-page headlines in all of the newspapers. Newspaper articles appeared warning women what to do and what not to do.
Albert, meanwhile, decided to pay a visit to his younger brother.
I was kind of happy to hear his voice calling me from downstairs, rang the bell and says, "Hey, it's your brother Al down here," but surprised at the same time because, you know, even though I knew at some point he would escape, I just didn't know when.
Richard agreed to help Albert. He gave him civilian clothes and a gun. Now, armed and dangerous, Albert made it out of Boston and headed north to the city of Lynn, where police were on the alert.
The captain grabbed me and he says, "We have information that DeSalvo's in Lynn." And I said, "Oh, wonderful, that's all we need today."
It was 36 hours after Albert had escaped. After walking around undetected for a few hours, dressed in an old Navy uniform he had found, Albert stopped at a shoe store and asked to use the phone. He said he needed, quote, to call F. Lee.
And as soon as he said that, we all turned and realized that that was DeSalvo. And while he was calling Bailey, we called the Lynn police and told them he's here. While we were waiting for the police, I don't know why, but I asked him, "Did you strangle all those 13 women?" And he responded, I think I got the words exactly as he responded, "I honestly don't know. I know I did some of them."
Within minutes, the police converged on the shoe store.
Well, we dashed into Simon's. He was standing in the rear of the store. I recognized him from the picture. And I asked him his name. He said it was DeSalvo, and I put the cuffs on him.
Did he give you a hard time?
No, he didn't.
Did he say anything to you?
He said he was DeSalvo.
As the different police agencies fought over the privilege of returning Albert to jail, DeSalvo was paraded before the swarm of reporters.
There would do no harm to nobody. My only purpose of leaving.
Okay, let's go, Al. Did you keep that promise?
I did. I didn't bother nobody.
After the fact, Albert DeSalvo insisted that his escape was meant to protest his being sentenced to a prison instead of a mental institution.
Albert has had a single-minded and often articulated desire ever since he got in the place, and he initially retained me for the purpose of getting him to an institution where there were doctors. It was that simple.
After his capture, Albert was promptly shipped to the place he had tried desperately to avoid, Massachusetts' toughest penitentiary, Walpole. There, he was reunited with George Nasser, who was serving a life term for murder. The two hatched a deal they hoped would bring them money and fame.
My agreement with Al was simply this. If you promise me that you will confess to the crimes, not lie, confess to the crimes that you say you committed, and you will follow through with the program of psychiatric treatment and of assisting your family and of publishing a book concerning your crimes and concerning your treatment, I'll help you. It's a contract.
Nasser began helping DeSalvo draft his book, and he rarely left Albert's side.
Nasser was always there, and even though we asked him a couple of times, what does he have to be here? I mean, this is family, you know? He says, well, he's only going to advise. I says, he's sitting there doing nothing.
Albert decided to cash in on his infamy with a sideline business. In the prison crafts room, he began assembling women's jewelry. His specialty was chokers. But Albert also had serious problems to face. He was a walking target for the other inmates.
And they were all going to get him, you know. Could have been my sister, could have been my mother, could have been this. They all wanted to be heroes. I can get the Boston Strangler and I go up another couple of notches.
They would affect the vengeance that the society felt was his due. They were saying, hey, You killed 13 women, some of whom were mothers, and you're going around bragging about it and finding that funny and talking about making chokers for women and laughing and giggling about this.
It wasn't long before prison life took its toll on Albert. Within a few months, he looked as though he had aged years.
He was worn out, absolutely worn out. He wasn't a guy to do time.
6 years later, on November 22nd, 1973, Albert was stabbed to death in prison. He was 42 years old. 12 hours before his murder, he had made a phone call to one of his old psychiatrists.
He said that he wanted to meet with me to tell the real story of the Boston Strangler. We were going to meet him at 9 a.m. Monday morning. He was killed at 2 a.m. that morning.
My belief was that he was going to say how he got into this here, that he wasn't the Boston Strangler, who put him up to it, and name names.
That was one theory. There were others.
Albert was selling speed in the prison, and he was selling it at less than the syndicate price, and he'd been warned, don't do that. And Albert didn't take orders from anybody, and this time they killed him.
He was killed over 2 pounds of institution bacon. He was supposed to give a pound to someone else and didn't.
The case of Albert DeSalvo's murder remains open, and so do the Boston Stranglings. Despite widespread public certainty that DeSalvo was the strangler, some of those familiar with the case have lingering questions.
Everyone wanted the Boston Strangler off the street. And if someone wanted to confess to it at that time and could give any reasons why he was, I think we were willing to accept it.
He wanted to be world-renowned. And of course, if you confess to the worst serial murder since Jack the Ripper, you're going to be famous, infamous. Another reason that he had was that someone convinced him that if he confessed to being the Boston Strangler, he could make it a lot of money.
As far as the investigators are concerned, there is no mystery. Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler.
I've been asked many, many times over the years if I really thought that Albert DeSalvo was the Strangler. And I was positive 30 years ago, and I'm positive now.
Albert DeSalvo never published the book that he thought would make him a rich man. But shortly before his death, he did write a poem and gave it to his lawyer, Tom Troy.
Here's a story, The Strangler, yet untold. The man who claims he strangled 13 women, young and old. He struck within the light of day, leaving not one clue astray. To reveal his secret will bring him fame, but burden his family with unwanted shame. Today he sits in a prison cell, deep inside, only a secret he can tell. People everywhere are still in doubt. Is the Strangler in prison?